Okay, here we go. I think had we stopped with naturalism last time, or just about to do naturalism?
No, I think we had just passed anti-theism.
Okay.
I don't have my notes, but I remember that.
Okay. Anybody got any questions on anything that we already covered? Pantheism, very evidently, means just what the Greek indicates: pan for all, and theos for God. Everything is God. In some forms, naturalism becomes a kind of pantheism, because some thinkers would say that some thinkers would say that the world is God. They are basically materialists, but I guess if you write nature with a big enough N, that turns it into some kind of God. The classical form of pantheism, though, would be that which you find in Baruch Spinoza, who, of course, maintains that there is simply one being, and everything is its attributes and its modes, and the attributes may be physical or they may be spiritual, but they're all the same thing. And if you think there is actually multiplicity in the world or change, it's your own delusion. But that would be the classical pantheist. Probably out of 1.1 billion Hindus, I've been told by a Hindu friend of mine, 800 million of them are pantheists. The other 300 million hold a view of God which is very close to what Judeo-Christian thought would express. We'll come back to pantheism a little bit later. The more that we understand the concept of God, of course, the more it will become evident whether one could logically be a pantheist or not. Naturalism is simply the view that the only thing that exists is the world, and the world is self-explanatory. This, of course, is the view of virtually all contemporary scientific materialists. They don't like to be called materialists so much anymore, so they call themselves naturalists. But if you look at what is nature, nature for them is the physical world. So how they avoid calling themselves materialists, I don't know. They do it by saying they're not strict reductionists in the sense of reducing everything down to the material order. They allow there are some things that are qualitatively different than the basic building blocks of matter, but when you push them, the ultimate foundation for all of these qualitatively superior things that arise out of evolution is ultimately matter anyway, so they're still materialists. Naturalism is the big alternative to theism today, and it is the dominant one, which is expressed, I dare say, by all too many scientists. You don't have to be a naturalist to be a scientist, but you do have a terrible tendency to become such, especially if you have very vague philosophical or religious foundations, and then you study science for a while. It becomes awfully tempting to become simply a naturalist. In fact, I think, and I'm just trying to remember what I wrote in an article that's supposed to be published anytime now in Faith and Reason, but I had a citation that something like of the major scientists, 90% of them were atheists, and of the major biologists, 95% were. So something in that order. It wasn't very encouraging. These are the major ones. That doesn't mean that your average high school teacher of biology is an atheist. I'm not saying that at all. And in fact, I saw another citation about 10, 15 years ago that said some 30% of high school biologists were creationists, in the sense of scientific creationism. So I'm talking about the guys that are at the universities with relatively big names. They tend to fall into that category. Fideism is from the Latin fides, which means faith. And it says basically that the objects of religious faith cannot be proven by human reason. For example, God. Now, if you ask the typical Protestant in the United States whether the existence of God can be proven, he'll say, well, of course not. It's just a matter of faith. If you ask the typical Catholic in the United States whether the existence of God can be proven, he'll say, of course not. It's just a matter of faith. The difference between the Protestant and the Catholic there is simply the Catholic does not know what his own religion teaches, because it is a matter of Catholic doctrine that the existence of God can be known by the unaided light of natural reason. This was defined by Vatican Council I, Denziger, 1806. But fideism is alive and well. It's very typical, very easy for people to just set up an absolute opposition. On the one hand, you have reason, which means natural science, and on the other hand, you have faith, which is religion. And these two just walk separate paths. And you can't expect them to agree with each other, and frequently they don't. Sometimes people defend religion by saying, well, so it contradicts science, but that's all right. We've got two ways of going here, and it's the old Averroistic double verities, the double truth theory, that the truth of God and the truth of the natural world or reason are two different things. But as St. Thomas points out, God is the author of reason, and therefore he clearly would not contradict himself. What you arrive at by reason and what is revealed by faith must be harmonious, cannot be in contradiction to one another. But the fideist would say, no, this is just a matter of faith. What we hold as religion is simply a matter of faith, I dare say almost blind faith, and therefore science or reason would be on the other side of the coin. The difficulty with that, of course, is that it makes it appear that reason is all on the side of science, and therefore if you hold a religious belief about something, it's just your own private belief and not to be taken seriously in the public arena. And that's where you get this kind of notion that you can't impose your religious views on others, because the presumption is that they are not based on reason, but purely private faith commitments. This leads to all kind of havocs, because then you have politicians standing up and saying, well, this is what I personally believe, say I'm opposed to abortion, but I have no right to impose my private personal belief on anybody else, such as the body politic, which I represent by holding an office. So they have a nice, neat little division between themselves as personal individuals and themselves as political figures, which allows them, of course, to hold political views that are diametrically opposed to their religious views.
That type of dichotomy was taught by Luther, too.
Yeah.
He said the prince may be a Christian, but it's not as a Christian that he will govern.
That is quite believable, for the same reason that he was a positivist in terms of morality. He would say that if God had wanted adultery to be licit, it would be. So this whole idea of the harmony of faith and reason, the notion that natural law, ethics, is based upon the nature of man, that you can't just make it up, that's what's being violated by fideism, because fideism rips the foundation for any kind of a natural law evaluation of society. If it's all a matter of pure faith, then you have no basis for saying, well, reason proscribes certain beliefs. That, of course, is what you run into with the question of homosexual acts, because homosexual acts, some might say, well, you believe that as a matter of religion, but you dare not raise it as an objection to somebody's behavior. I've always thought it was kind of funny, because for the longest time we know that there's perhaps 85% of the people practicing contraception. And natural law, of course, says contraception is immoral. But the odd thing is, people don't get all upset if you preach or teach against contraception. They'll say, well, I disagree with you. But if you preach or teach against homosexual acts, they'll say, well, you're discriminating against me. Well, why don't all the people that are practicing contraception say, you're discriminating against my lifestyle? You're discriminating against my sexual behavior? They don't. They just say, I disagree with you, and I'm going to do my own thing. The next topic here is the preambles to faith, or the preambula fidei.
Just play that.
Amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, to the beat.
For the sake of that.
What the preambles of faith are, this is where we're going to get into some meat here that's interesting. These are rationally demonstrable philosophical truths that are presupposed by religious faith. Of course, the fideists don't really have any use for preambles to faith because they don't need them. It's all just a matter of faith. It is specifically found in Catholic philosophical and theological teaching that there are rational foundations, rational givens, which you really have to have prior to the ascent of faith. For example, the existence of God. For example, what's the other? Oh yeah, epistemological realism. What on earth do we mean? Epistemological realism. Why is that prior to the act of faith? What is epistemological realism? I don't know, I presume this was covered at some point before, but epistemological realism means that the science of epistemology enables us to know that there are things outside of ourselves. We can know them. In the history of the world, we have certain figures. If you are Jewish, do you believe in Moses? If you are Muslim, do you believe in Muhammad? If you are Christian, do you believe in Jesus? How could you know these historical personages even existed if you don't know the person next to you, if you don't know the world around you? So it's absolutely necessary that one be an epistemological realist. In other words, that we maintain from reason that we are able to know the things in the world around us. If you aren't able to do that, if you can't justify that, then you would have no reason to justify accepting some historical figure upon which your religious beliefs are based. The alternative would be epistemological idealism, which would say, I don't know things outside of me, I only know these ideas or images or mental impressions within me. Now that's got a very strong tradition within modern philosophy, as you know. So if you're an idealist, epistemologically, I'm not talking about metaphysically, Plato was a metaphysical idealist, but not an epistemological idealist. Epistemology has to do with what we know. Metaphysics deals with what is. See, if you maintain that all that you know are your own internal impressions, you've got no way of knowing some external reality, so you'd have no basis for believing in some historically based revelation or religion. So before you can, frankly, be either Protestant or Catholic or Muslim or Jewish, you have to be a realist in your epistemology. Moreover, you need to know that God exists, because if you don't know that God exists, what are you looking for revelation for? And a little worse than that one, this is one that people often don't think about, you got to know that God is not a liar. How do you know that one? What are you going to do? Say, well, it says right in the good book. That's not going to work. First thing any liar does is to convince you of his sincerity. So if God were lying, he could publish revelation which would be completely misleading, completely false. So you could say, this is revelation, it does come from God, I know that it truly reveals what God is telling me, But unless I know ahead of time, somehow, that God is truthful, I would have no way to know that I should believe this revelation. So we have to have what we call these preambles to faith. There are certain things you got to know before the act of faith is going to make reasonable sense. And indeed, the existence of God is one of them. Miracles do happen, thank you.
Chesterton says the devil never keeps his word.
Well, he probably keeps it sometimes to his advantage.
You know, all general statements are false, but at any rate, that's what he did say. The devil never keeps his word.
Yes, father of liars, father of lies. But our problem right now isn't the devil, it's God. We have to know that God exists, and therefore that one could even expect that there'd be such a thing as revelation, and if it is given, that there's reason to believe it, that there's reason to trust it. All right, let's go on to the next point here. The nature and the problem of proving God's existence. I realize we've already dealt with God's existence, but we are going to shortly be looking at how we know the nature of God. And before we do that, we need to just reflect a little bit on this whole question of what was involved in proving God's existence. What were we doing, and why did we need to do it? This is one of the preambula fidei. So it is appropriate and reasonable that men should prove, or at least come to know by natural reason, the existence of God. We do know St. Paul in Romans 1:20 chastises the Romans for their failure to realize God in virtue or by reason of the things that he has made. That they were held responsible for not recognizing God's existence. This is a natural knowledge which human beings would be expected to have. Certainly civilization would be expected to have. Vatican Council I says that the existence of God can be known, that is, the true God, what we normally mean by the word God, can be known with certainty by unaided reason from the things that he has made. This was defined at Vatican Council I in, 1870? And I believe it was Pius X in the Oath Against Modernism who explicitly said that you could prove it by causality. It could be known by causality. They were careful not to say that God's existence could be demonstrated, although it was understood that to some people it could be proven. This didn't mean that everybody had to know how to do it philosophically. And when you talk about demonstrating that, that to some extent implies proving to another. And I think they were trying to get away from that a little bit. What they're saying is, you can know it. And man naturally tends to know it simply by reason of looking at the world around us and asking, where did this come from? It didn't come out of a Cracker Jack box. It has to have some explanation which is transcendent. And there also is an aspect to this that we ought by reason to come to a realization that God is a personal God, not simply an impersonal creator, as some would say, or a supreme being in a completely impersonal sense. And there's reasons as to why we should know God as a personal being. We'll come to that later on as we go through some of the divine modes. Okay, before we look at that, the The basic thrust of any argument for God's existence is to start with the things we find in the world around us. But not everybody has argued in that vein. You're probably aware of St. Anselm and his famous ontological argument, where he said, if you just understand the concept of God, that is sufficient to enable you to know that God exists. Why? Simple reasoning. Because God is that, when you think about it, God is that than which none greater can exist. That's the definition of God, that than which none greater can be. But, and certainly the fact that I can say this and understand it means that this concept, this meaning, this entity exists in my mind. But I have a problem. If that than which none greater can exist existed only in my mind, then I can conceive of a greater being, namely one that would exist in reality as well as in my mind. So that than which none greater can be or exist must exist not only in my mind but also in reality. Therefore God exists. This is an argument I'm not going to spend too much time on, but down through the history of philosophy, we've had people lining up on both sides of this one. Descartes, Lotze, we've had a number of major philosophers, even to the present time, who have argued that this is an effective argument. Others, like St. Thomas Aquinas and Immanuel Kant, said no, it isn't. Kant's famous rebuttal is that existence is not a predicate. You know, when you're describing a being, you don't say, oh, well, he's a carpenter and he's 6 feet tall and he has blue eyes and he weighs 180 pounds and he exists. Notice that last one? We add he exists. What attribute did we just add? That's not just another predicate, another qualification. The way Kant put it is 100 real pennies or pfennigs is not one more penny than 100 imaginary pennies. Existence is not just an additional predicate. So you can't just say, I can imagine a being that would be even greater, namely it exists in reality as well as in my mind, because you haven't added a predicate there. St. Thomas rejects the argument basically because you can't argue from what's in your mind to what is outside the mind. You can't argue just because you're thinking about something that therefore makes it real. It is true that if God exists necessarily. That is to say, if God exists, God's the kind of being that could not be. The problem is that's only true if God exists. But if God doesn't exist, there is no such being. Anyway, that was one track that some have gone down. But the more traditional track, and by the way, St. Anselm did not use just that argument. He also was aware of the more traditional arguments. More traditional arguments begin with the world. They start with the things that we find in the world and see that they don't explain themselves fully. And so we need to look for some exterior explanation, and we find we can't go to infinity taking prior causes. I'm not going through all the arguments because I know you've heard them in one form or another several times now. And therefore we must come to some kind of a first cause. And so we basically argue to God by seeing the effects that he has produced in the world. The effects don't explain themselves. Things that are in motion don't explain their own motion. So we reason back through intermediate movers to a first mover unmoved. This is the classical thrust of any argument to God's existence. It is the nature of the argument that I gave you from the De Ente et Essentia a couple classes ago. We start with finite beings composed of essence and existence. They don't explain their own existence. They get it from something else. You can't go to infinity and looking for the source ultimately you must come to a first being in which existence and essence are identical. And that would be an infinite being, not a finite being. That's the kind of structure that the arguments will entail. And if you go through the 5 ways, of course, what you've done in each case is to start with some series of effects, things that are in motion, a series of caused causes, beings that are contingent rather than necessary, less than perfect beings, beings that are governed. And from each of those starting points, you ultimately conclude to a first mover unmoved, a first cause uncaused, a necessary being whose necessity is explained by itself, a supreme being which is a most perfect being and contains all the lesser perfections of lesser beings, and a supreme governor of the entire creative order. So that the general thrust of the arguments always move in that direction. This leads us then to the next point, which is, how then do we know the nature of God? If the arguments run from the things in the world about us through a kind of argument from causality, back to God as the first cause and explanation, how then do we know about the nature of God? Notice there are 2 different things. How do we know that God exists is one question. The other question is, how do we know what kind of a being God is? What is the nature of God? The proofs for God's existence aim at simply that, his existence. But it's a different enterprise to try to discover the nature of God. As a matter of fact, in the Summa Theologiae, when St. Thomas goes through the 5 ways, he uses a nominal definition in every case. He says, and this, when you come to a first mover unmoved, he says, and this is what all men call God. And a first cause uncaused, he says, and this is what all men call God. That's a nominal definition. What he's saying is, what we have discovered, this first mover, this first cause, this necessary being, he's just telling you that's what we call God. But he doesn't give an essential definition of God. That is not actually done for several more articles in the Summa Theologiae. Because in order to prove the existence of God, you've got to prove a conception that corresponds to that which we actually understand by God. And it may be that a first mover unmoved is not that. In other words, you need to complete, you need to fill out the definition, the understanding, the nature of God before you can be sure that these arguments have led to what we commonly understand by the term God. So, how are we going to know the nature of God? We have what are called this triplex via, or threefold way. We know the nature of God by causality, by negation, and by analogy. I know that Dr. Waters has covered this before. Causality, negation, and analogy. But let's just run through them again, because we're going to have to be using them when we deal with the divine modes. Causality just comes right back to that very basic principle we were talking about some classes back, and that is that you don't get something from nothing. You don't get being from non-being. Nihil dat quod non habet. Nothing can give what it does not have. So this much we know. If we find some positive aspect of being in the world, and if God is the first cause, it's got to come from God. And by the way, all of the arguments for the nature of God are drawn from the proofs for his existence. So you really kind of have to know the proofs for his existence before you can talk about the nature. What proofs are we going to be using? Well, of course, the 5 ways, anything that we could have learned from the 5 ways, but also the argument from the De Ente et Essentia, which I went through with you. And that one immediately tells us that God is a supreme being and the cause of the existence of every creature. Therefore, any reality, any being, any existence, any perfection, any quality that we find in a creature comes from God, ultimately. So if you apply the principle that nothing can give what it doesn't have, then anything that you find in the created world, any positive reality or perfection, since it ultimately comes from God, in some way it has to be traced back to God, and we have to say, well, if we find it in the world, it must be somehow found in God, because God couldn't give it to a creature if he didn't already possess it. You can't give what you don't have. Very easy way, I'm going to skip ahead here, but just to put a couple things in place. How do we know that God is intelligent? How do we know that God is a person? Well, are we intelligent? And that's a dangerous question. Are we superior to a rock because we have intelligence? If we are, and I think most would claim that they are, then that perfection ultimately comes from God. How could God make us intelligent if he wasn't? Moreover, is it not a perfection, an existential perfection, to be a person? If one doesn't know the meaning of this question, then you don't know what it is to be yourself. Are you not, by being a person, of greater value or worth than the table you're sitting in front of? Again, how could God then create persons, by whatever means, if he did not already possess within himself that perfection? That's the way that the argument works. So anything that you find in the created order must ultimately come from God. That's causality. Negation or remotion. That means we remove negative qualities that are seemingly discovered by way of causality. For example, we have intelligence, but it doesn't always work very well. It's just like we have memory, but that doesn't always work very well. In fact, the longer we have it, the worse it works. When we use our intelligence, we have to go through a process of reasoning. These are all signs of limitation, imperfection. So when you find in the creature some kind of a limiting factor, some kind of a sign of imperfection, that has to be removed when we predicate it of God. The most obvious example, again, to go back to the on being in essence argument, finite beings. They're beings, they have existence, but they're limited. God is the unlimited being. You take away the limit, you negate the negation to affirm what is found in God. So if the creature is limited, God is not limited. This, of course, applies in the case of evil. Because when you find evil, for example, evil is defined as the lack of a due perfection. For example, a horse ought to see. So if you have a blind horse, that's an imperfection in the horse. So when we talk about something like blindness, we understand it in terms of sight. Sight is the positive perfection. You don't need a direct cause for the blindness. The blindness is just the absence of sight. So when we say we remove the negation or remove the limitation in the creature, we're not taking something positive away from God. We are removing something which really is non-being. We're removing a limitation. We're removing something that was restricting the being that we're looking at. And that's why we negate anything that would be limiting on the part of the creature. when we apply it to God. I probably should point out that in trying to understand the nature of God, there's an entire tradition among the Neoplatonists, Plotinus and others after Christ, who just said, well, God is ineffable. God is so totally beyond us, we can't know anything about him. So that's what this is answering. This is what St. Thomas and others are responding to. It is tempting to say that God is so utterly transcendent to the world that we can't know anything at all about him. And yet, using these principles, it is possible to know something. You don't have to just give up. That is a trip into basic irrationality. We can say that God is ineffable in that it's impossible for us to adequately speak about God. It is impossible for us to express. When we say God has intelligence, what do we mean by that? I don't know what we mean by it. I know it means he certainly can do what we do. We have the ability to understand things, so God must be able to do that. How does he do it? What way does he do it in himself? There's no way to put yourself in his position and know just what it is that he's doing. So there is a certain sense in which the nature of God is transcendent and unspeakable to us. But that doesn't mean that we can't say something that is true about God. I know that God is intelligent. I know God is infinitely intelligent, but I don't know what I just said. I know that I'm referring to some positive reality that's far better than what I've got. And I know that it's really in God because it's something I've got that a stone doesn't have. See, so I am saying something. But if you ask me, what have I said about it as it exists in God himself? Well, that's where we can't quite go. But that doesn't mean we should therefore shut our mouths and say nothing. So that's why these three approaches are helpful. Causality, negation, finally analogy. Something is analogous when it's not quite the same and not utterly different. It indicates both a similarity and difference at the same time. For example, an atom is a being, an earthworm is a being, a flower is a being, a tiger is a being, and you are a being. Are you all the same being? Clearly not. The word being, predicated of each of you, has radically different meaning. It's the same in the sense that all are not nothing, but the way that they are not nothing is radically different. So the term being is predicated analogously. It's not like saying Fido is a dog and Butch is a dog. That's the univocal use of terms, has the same meaning. See, they both are in the same species. But when I say Butch is a being and an angel is a being, that's an analogous use of the term being. So when we talk about what we find in creatures, and when these properties give us some understanding about what exists in God, the predication is always analogous. It is a matter of analogy, or the other term that goes here is participation. Participation means to receive, as it were, a little bit of something. It's from pars and chipere. Pars meaning a part, chipere to receive. So when we participate, we receive a part of something. Creatures participate in divine perfections. The perfections of God are manifest in various creatures. But clearly, no individual creature contains everything that is found within God. And the infinite perfection of God is such that creatures, we need countless numbers of creatures to manifest all the different kinds of perfection that are found in God. And even then, they don't begin to do it. So when we find a perfection in a creature, you could say because of causality, it comes from God. So in some way the creature is like unto God and tells us something about God, but we can't say that God is like the creature. The relationship here is real on the part of the creature, but it's only what we call logical on the part of God. It doesn't make him different. So what positive qualities or attributes creatures share or receive, we say God simply is. Why will be more evident when we get to the notion of divine simplicity. The analogy that we find between creatures and God is that we creatures receive certain perfections. God, in whom essence and existence are identical, in other words, he is as unified as being can be, in God, God doesn't have these perfections, rather he is the perfection. The creature has existence, that is to say, our essence or nature receives existence, and that's why we are caused. We didn't always exist, we begin to be, we could cease to be. We receive existence, we are caused beings. Existence is added to us to make us be. If that were the case with God, he'd be a creature. So God doesn't receive existence, we say he is existence. His nature, his essence is his to be. And in being is to be, remember, everything that is real in any way, shape, or manner is such because it has being. So when we say God is pure existence, which is what you're saying when his essence and existence are identical, when you say God is pure existence, what you're saying is he's already got every possible perfection. But he has it in one act of being. The analogy we're talking about is not a simple analogy of extrinsic attribution. They're extrinsic attribution. Some people say, well, God is like us because he's the creator. The analogy of extrinsic attribution says basically that the cause is analogous to the effect only in the sense that it produces the effect. It'd be like saying when you mow the lawn, you're a lawnmower. And that's all we know about you. And it doesn't really tell us much about you except that you mowed the lawn. Or if you make a watch, you're a watchmaker. That doesn't really tell us much. And it doesn't tell us, be as clearly, does that mean, if I'm a lawnmower, does that mean I'm the lawn? Or if I make watches, does that mean I'm a watch? And obviously there's something wrong here. The analogy of attribution that we are concerned about here has to be an intrinsic attribution. It's got to be something in the thing, in the creature, that reveals something about the nature of God himself. And the basic analogy, there's several types of analogy, I'm not going to get into all of them right now, but the basic kind of analogy is what we call an analogy of simple proportion. Simple proportion. What the creature has, God is. What the creature has, God is. So creatures receive these various attributes or perfections, God is them. God is an equivocal cause in the sense that he is not of the same nature as the thing that he produces. A univocal kind of causation would have when one individual in a species procreates another individual in the species. So if Thomas procreates James, they're in the same species, see? That's univocal. But that's not what God does when he creates creatures. His is a kind of equivocal creation. What am I saying? Equivocal causality. This is an equivocal causality, not unlike a painter producing a painting. When a painter produces a painting, or when you mow the lawn, you see there is an extrinsic attribution there, but there's also something else going on. When a painter paints a painting, what does he put into the painting? Does he make the paint? Does he make the easel that he's working with? Does he make the colors? Not really. What he's really doing, what the artist is putting into the work, primarily is a work within his mind. He is organizing and structuring the materials in his mind, and then perhaps using his hands to form on the canvas what he's trying to put there. So there's a lot of stuff going onto that canvas that he's not putting there. But he is expressing something that we see when we look at the painting. We see a certain intellectual insight, hopefully a certain degree of talent and genius being expressed on that canvas. And that part of it is not merely extrinsic attribution, but it's really revealing something of the nature of the artist. But when you're dealing with creatures, that's the way it is. We aren't really making everything, you see. We start with something. We have some materials with which we are operating. The lawnmower, when I'm mowing my lawn, I need to have my lawnmower, right? That thing I have to push. And it's got to have sharp blades. It is very useful. It's very hard for me to get down on my hands and knees and bite off the grass. So I'm using this kind of instrumental causality, but that instrument does all sorts of things for me that I can't do myself and wouldn't do myself. I'm primarily responsible for pushing the thing around and where it goes. And that, of course, does take a certain degree of intellect, or you'd never get the lawn mowed, would you? You don't do it like you're going through a pretzel. See, there has to be some organization there. And that reveals some measure of intelligence. Somebody totally lacking intelligence. Can you imagine what his lawn would look like after he got through mowing it? It wouldn't be through. It would just have all kinds of patterns on it. So when we look at the world and try to understand God from it, what we are doing is discerning in creatures those elements that are properly predicable of God, because they are real perfections in the world around us. They must come from God by causality. We remove the negations, but we understand that it is an analogous predication that we're using, that the God is in some way being revealed by these positive qualities, but that the quality in God does not exist in the same way that it exists in the creature. That it exists in the creature in a limited way. In God it would be in an unlimited way. And there are some things that just aren't properly to be predicated of God at all. Yes?
How would you explain the problem of evil? Because right now we're talking about the perfections in the world reflecting God's perfection. So people are going to say, well, what about all this evil? Doesn't he cause that?
Well, that's on the next page.
Oh, okay.
And it's more than on the next page, because that has to be treated as a separate topic. It is a big one. But fundamentally, let's give a very quick answer, because to get it on at least this same CD. It's like the example I gave you of the horse with blindness. God is the cause of the horse. God is the cause of horses having sight. But the fact that a horse is blind is not something we have to predicate of God. That's the lack of a perfection that ought to be there. We need a direct cause for a positive perfection. Now, if something is missing, that need not be attributed directly to the cause. It's like the donut. You know, if you're going to make donuts, you got to make all you got to explain is the brown part, the outside. Do you have to explain the hole in the middle? I mean, you don't need any dough to make the hole. I'm not really sure how they do them right now. Do we go around and punch holes in those poor donuts after we're done with them?
Tin bit.
Pardon me?
It's a tin bit.
Okay, well, so all things have their causes. But it's fundamentally the same thing. You need to explain what is there, but you don't need to explain what is absent. The problem with evil is, of course, you got to understand, well, what exactly is evil? Is it a positive thing in its own right? We'll come to it. Unless something evil happens. All right, so the point number 3. Oh, and I might add, when we say God is alive, it's because he causes life in human beings. But what we mean when we say God is alive is not understood fully by our reflection on our own life. The divine attributes or names, therefore, are all predicated analogously. In other words, we're going to come up with a series of qualities or attributes that can be said of God, but they are attributed analogously, not univocally, not to be surprised. So when we say that God is wise, we can say that we know God is wise because there's wisdom in us, but that doesn't mean that God is wise in the same way that we are wise. The names of God, therefore, do not express the divine essence directly. What we do is we name God from looking at creatures by using causality and negation and analogy. But these qualities do represent something actually in God. Because you might say, but it's just equivocal. You know, you're using a word doesn't mean anything to God. Using the same principle, nothing can give what it doesn't have. If a perfection is found in the creature, it's only because it pre-exists in the Creator. That's why we say the perfection exists preeminently in God. If we find wisdom in a creature, it could not be there if it did not first exist in God in order to give it to the creature. So every positive perfection exists preeminently in the Creator. It pre-exists in God. God is not good, then, because he causes goodness. That would be extrinsic attribution. God is not good because he causes goodness. Rather, he causes goodness because he is good. We don't say that he's good merely because he causes goodness, but because of the principle of causality, he's able to cause goodness in creatures because goodness exists in him in the first place. So, in a sense, in other words, a lawnmower or a painter is not just a lawnmower or a painter because they happen to produce the mowing of a lawn or a painting. They are lawnmowers because there's in them the existential causality capable of producing this particular effect. Within the painter, there is the existential perfection capable of doing whatever it is he does to the painting. There's a lot of stuff he doesn't do. You know, he buys the materials. But there is something he does do, and that's has to pre-exist in him as a cause. So too with God. God is not merely the creator that produces these things, but also because he's creating them, this is positively coming from his being, and therefore by looking at the creatures, we really do learn something about what exists in God. Okay, I'm going to take one more. I'm going to take the first point on the next page here, and then we'll have to stop for lack of time. Most of these topics you see on the next page are actually found in the Summa Theologiae right after the existence of God is proven. So that's kind of the order that I'm following. I'm just going to try to take the first one tonight. God is not a body. What is this? And in each case, what we're going to do is two things. We're going to look at the meaning of the attribute, and then we will prove that it's true, that it's correct to say that. God is not a being, is not a body. What does it mean? God is a purely spiritual being. God, there is no matter in God. How do we know this? Simple. The first cause cannot be composed of matter and form. There's a composition of matter and form. You don't have just pure matter. Matter is always informed. If it's composed of matter and form, something's composing it, so it can't be the first cause. Moreover, matter is pure potency. But God, as we see in the prima via, the first way, God is pure act. Matter is also a principle of limitation. Things that are material are limited in space and time. So you've got to remove that limitation. So God cannot be material. To say that a thing is material is to bind it, to limit it within space and time, inherent in the very nature of being material. Now, obviously, naturalists would like to have you think God is material. Because that's all that exists for them is material. And how do you prove they're wrong? You prove them wrong by the proofs for God's existence. The De Ende argument shows that God has no limitation. So clearly, nature, material nature, which is limited in countless ways, cannot be God. The physical world is constantly, because it's material and physical, it's subject to change and motion. But the first mover is pure act, not subject to motion. Anything that's subject to motion is moved by another. So we prove God's existence by noticing that the material universe is subject to motion. That's the first way. But in proving that things subject to motion are ultimately caused by something that is not subject to motion, what you have shown is that the first mover cannot be part of the material universe because material things are subject to motion. So again, God is not material. Pantheism also has the problem that you're making God either partially or totally material. So, because the material world is real, and if it's part of God or is God, then you have denied what we have just shown, namely that God cannot be material. So saying God is not a body demonstrates that both naturalism and pantheism must be false. Simplicity comes next, but we'll save that for the next class. Thank you.
This recording is produced and distributed by Olteen Library Services, all rights reserved. For more, go to www.aquinasphilosophy.com.